In order to use sine, cosine, and tangent to solve for an unknown angle, we first have to refresh ourselves on what sine, cosine, and tangent represent. So we use the mnemonic SOCAHTOA to remember this. And we start with sine, which is the ratio of the opposite leg to the hypotenuse, and cosine, which is the ratio of the adjacent leg to the hypotenuse, and finally tangent, which is the ratio of the opposite leg to the adjacent leg. And here we see, in order to know which legs we're talking about, we always need an angle. And opposite and adjacent refer to where that angle is positioned in the triangle. So the side opposite that angle is called the opposite leg. This leg adjacent to that angle is called the adjacent leg. And then the side opposite the 90-degree angle is always called the hypotenuse. So as an example, I'm showing the cosine of an angle over to the right here. And you can see the cosine of any angle equals the adjacent leg over the hypotenuse. Now for this problem, we're not trying to find the ratio, we're actually trying to find the angle measurement. And how can you find an angle measurement when it's inside the cosine function? And as you can see here, for the cosine function, the angle is the input, and then the ratio is the output. So if we wanted to switch these guys so that we could put a ratio in and get an angle measurement out, that's actually called an inverse function. And this one is called the inverse cosine function. And we know that it's the inverse function because we write a -1 as a superscript to the cosine. So cos -1 of a ratio will return an angle measurement for us. So again, the inverse of a function just switches the inputs and the outputs. And I'm going to show you how you're going to use your calculator to actually evaluate this function. But to find an angle, we're going to use the inverse cosine function, or the inverse sine function, or the inverse tan function. So let's look at an example. Here we're trying to find x, and as you can see, x is the angle. We have an unknown angle, and we're trying to solve for it. But luckily, we have two side lengths. The 5 is opposite the angle, so that's our opposite leg. And the 10 is across from the 90-degree angle, so as we know, that's the hypotenuse. And the function that relates the opposite leg to the hypotenuse is the SO in SOCAHTOA. So if I set up my relationship, I get sine of x equals 5/10. Now, x is inside the sine, so we can't solve for it this way. So instead, we're going to use the inverse function, which we write, but sine to the -1 of the ratio 5/10 equals x. And then to do this in the calculator, usually the inverse sine function is the second of the sine function. On my calculator, you can see it's in blue above sine. And you simply type that in, you type in 5/10, and you end up getting an angle measurement, which as you can see here is 30. So in this case, x equals 30. So remember, when you're trying to find an unknown angle in a right triangle, use inverse sine, inverse cosine, or inverse tangent.